Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sab Ino, and today I'm absolutely delighted to have as my guest Glen Merzer, who's a prolific author, writer, vegan activist in his own right, and the author of many of his own books, including co-authoring some major transformative books with other people. His book, America Goes Vegan, is, I believe, the most recent book. One of the real iconic books for me is Food is Climate that he wrote, but he also co-authored several books with Chef AJ, who's a friend of the NHA, including Unprocessed and the Secrets to Ultimate Weight Loss, and a book with Pam Popper, Food Over Medicine. So Glen, I'm just so excited. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world, championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sab Ino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Frank. I'm delighted to be here.
You know, as normally I like to start off with getting people to know a little bit about the journey that got you somewhat to where you are. And I know you grew up on the South Shore of Long Island, which I love because I grew up in the Bronx. And actually, you grew up very close to a place that gave me my first love of the ocean, Jones Beach.
Yes, I used to go there as a child.
And when we were in the Bronx, going to Jones Beach, that seemed in those days like an all-day journey. It felt like we were going to another country from the Bronx. But it was my first place to really bask in the beauty of the ocean environment. And Jones, I think, represented that for a lot of people from the city and those environs back then, you know?
Yeah, I grew up in Belmore.
Yes.
Which, by the way, is where Lenny Bruce grew up. And I used to take my bike from Belmore to Jones Beach.
Yeah, so it was a little hop for you, not so bad. I noticed that when I was listening to an interview of yours, you had made the point that you got turned on very early to vegetarianism because of some issues related to health issues in some of your family members.
Yeah.
And then you made that jump to vegetarianism, but then it took a little bit of a kind of a semi-health crisis about 16 years later to kind of really go all vegan. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about that journey?
Yes. I didn't really know my grandparents. They were all dead before I was born, except one I knew when I was a few years old, and then he died. So I barely knew one. So they were, one died of cancer, but three, I think, of heart disease. And on my father's side, all his cousins seemed to die in their 50s of heart disease. My mother got angina and had bad heart pains just walking up 6 steps. And that was in her 50s. And she had 2 brothers, and they died of heart attacks, one in his 40s, one in his 50s. So those 2 uncles I lost when I was 16. And I looked around and I thought, if I eat the way these people eat, I will be middle-aged at 25. Do I want to be middle-aged at 25? And I decided to just give up meat and become a vegetarian. Now, I don't think I read any books. I'm certain I didn't read any scientific studies. I do remember hearing the comedian Dick Gregory talking about vegetarianism, so I think I was maybe just following his lead. It just, you know, if you look at a hamburger, it looks like a heart attack. You know, it just seemed obvious to me, and I think it was fairly common knowledge, even back in the 1970s, that meat causes heart disease. I think everybody knew it. So I gave up meat the first day of the summer vacation after my junior year in high school when I was 17. I got up in the morning. I had an English muffin for breakfast. The phone rang. It was my old buddy Dave. I said, Dave, congratulate me. I became a vegetarian. He said, that's great. Since when? And I said, well, since breakfast. And he laughed at me. So it's now been 50 years. And, if he's going to laugh at me, I'm going to keep my word.
It's funny. That story is reminiscent. When I first got exposed to the idea of actually fasting, which is a big part of the NHA, I wanted to experience that. So I was a teenager, really myself, going into college, and I decided that this day I was going to fast. So I made this move. I went into the Bronx Botanical Gardens on Cherry Blossom Hill, and I laid there on my back. And I remember saying, well, now I'm fasting. I remember saying, well, I made it from breakfast to lunch,
There you go.
and it
There
was
you
the
go.
same kind of consciousness. It's like, but you know what? But it was kind of like an accomplishment in my mind. It was kind of like, wow, I kind of missed a meal or two. Oh my God, what
Yeah.
what a concept. Because growing up in an Italian household like I did, the idea of voluntary abstaining from food unless there was a famine was pretty much a foreign notion.
Right.
So
Right.
anyway, so then you went all of those years, and I know that there was a time when you started having some physical chest
Yes.
pain, and you
Yes.
decided you had to address the dairy issue or something in that
Right.
regard.
Well, what happened was I had an obese aunt and uncle. They were probably each 100 pounds overweight. And when I gave them the news at the age 17 that I became vegetarian, they were all very alarmed. They were very worried about me, not about themselves. And they said, where will you get your protein? And frankly, I took a guess. I said, I guess from cheese. I was guessing there was protein in cheese. It was a good guess. And so stupidly, for the next 19 years, I continued to eat cheese. I didn't have any other animal products. I didn't have eggs. I didn't drink milk. I didn't eat fish or any animal products. But stupidly, just to be sure that I wouldn't be protein deficient, I would have some cheese. I don't think I had too much of it, but there were times when I would have a lot of crackers with cream cheese or something like that. And then when I was about, well, mid-30s, I started to get these weird chest pains. I've asked cardiologists about it. They don't seem to know what it was. But it was like an electrical shock. I'd walk into a room, I'd get this electrical shock, and I'd fall to my knees. And then 2 minutes or 5 seconds later, it would be over, and I'd get up. But I kept getting these electrical shocks. And it happened about a dozen times. And then, a normal person would go to a cardiologist. I don't like going to doctors. So I just thought about it, and I thought, you know what? I'm not eating meat because of the saturated fat and cholesterol. What is cheese? Saturated fat and cholesterol. And so I gave up cheese. I've never had that sensation since. I've been fine.
What was the journey that took you from there to then eventually meeting like Howard Lyman, for example, and contributing to Mad Cowboy and No More
Right.
Bull and the books you wrote with him? Talk
Yeah.
about that journey. And I understood from that journey that that's what your foray was into investigating the whole issue of animal agriculture.
Right.
Am I right in assuming that when you made that
Yeah.
journey? Yes. Okay.
Yes. I mean, I was what I call a shy vegan, meaning that I was doing it for my own health. If you ask me about the animals, I care about the animals. It seems to me cruel what we do to the animals, but I wasn't what you would call an animal rights activist. I admire animal rights activists, but I just honestly, I wasn't on the street holding signs saying,
Right.
stop this cruelty to animals. I think I always had the feeling that the majority of people don't care about the animals, so it's apparently this cruelty is going to keep happening to animals, and there's nothing I could do about it. So I was doing it for my own health. So why would I bother trying to convince other people to go vegan? It wasn't my emphasis in life. I was frankly a writer, a playwright. I was trying to make people go to the theater and laugh out loud. That was my career path. And I was writing for network television in the meantime in Hollywood when somebody who knew me in the vegetarian community introduced me to Howard. And I have Howard's book here. Mad Cowboy. And so I helped Howard write Mad Cowboy, and I learned what he had done to the land he had inherited in Montana on what was once an organic dairy farm, and he turned it into a modern feedlot operation, brought more cows onto the land, housed them on cement, sprayed his crops with pesticides, injected his animals with antibiotics and hormones, and it's a horror. And then the land, the soil that used to be rich, loamy soil was turning dry and dusty. The birds were dying. There were no more worms in the land. And I realized this is what modern animal agriculture does. And if you think, well, the solution to that is grass-fed beef and regenerative agriculture, well, you know what? It turns out that in a certain sense, that's even worse. It's not worse for the animals, although they end up in the same slaughterhouses, but it's worse because it takes up more land. And in the climate crisis that we have, the only solution to it is to free up the land. Around 40% of the non-ice land surface of the earth is dedicated to the foolishness of grazing animals so that people can eat them. And if we free up that land, we could sequester so much carbon dioxide that we could end the climate emergency. And that's the only thing that'll possibly work.
Right.
So when people say, oh, I only eat grass-fed beef, well, you're doing more harm than if you ate the feedlot beef.
Let me come back. I want to come back to that and really pursue that with you a lot more.
Yeah.
We're going to just take a few moments to hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association. I'm here with Glen Merzer, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Are you ready to revolutionize your health? Then you're ready for the 2024 National Health Association Conference taking place in June of 2024. Join us for inspiring talks by experts like Drs. Dean and Aisha Shirzai, Dr. Neil Barnard, Dr. Ron Weiss, and Dr. Lori Marbus, in addition to Drs. Goldhammer, Dr. Esser, Dr. Fitzgerald, and yours truly, Dr. Frank Sabatino, along with leading SOS-free chefs Kathy Fisher, Brittany Giroudi, and Dylan Holmes. Register now at healthscience.org/NHA Conference and enjoy early bird savings until December 31st of 2023. This conference will transform your health journey. Secure your spot today. And remember, your feedback matters. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Also, be sure to visit the NHA website at healthscience.org. That's healthscience.org to get lots of great recipes, articles, newsletter archives, and become a member of the NHA. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host, and now back to the show. Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. So, Glen, you started to get into this discussion of land resources and all of that, and this is such a huge area because there's a lot of misinformation that is promoted around that idea. And let me take it a step back because I looked at an interview that you did with Chef AJ called Convenient Truth, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, entertaining, right on. I had a couple of things, though, that I wanted to touch on with you about that, if you don't mind, because
Please.
I want to get behind the veil a little bit. We're going to touch the wizard behind the veil because in that presentation, when you looked at the medical input to the society, doctor treatments, when you looked at climate scientists, when you looked at the various things that you touched on in that presentation, you were very kind. You kept coming back to this idea that the reason why these very brilliant and bright people are making these choices because of their cultural directives that they grew up with. Many times they're eating food that they associated with the love of their parents and families. And in many ways, they didn't feel that the eating habits of the general population could comply with the kinds of things that we know need to change. So you kept doing that. And yet, in my experience, and I know you have this experience too, we've actually been so inundated with seeds of greed that have been planted and brought to fruition for so long by many of the associations and conglomerates behind these sometimes very well-meaning people. And I think it kind of overlooked that. One of the reasons I'm saying that is that when we know that animal agriculture is the number one problem with climate change, it's like, according to Sailesh Rao, about 87%. You brought up the things that were missing, bringing it over 90%. And
Right.
yet, the UN governmental panel, the International Panel on Climate Change, working with the Food and Agriculture Organization, keeps emphasizing that emissions are the problem and downplaying the impact of animal agriculture, when Sailesh Rao very clearly states it's really a kind of an interesting thing behind the scenes, because that organization that's getting information from the FAO, that FAO is really on the payroll of meat and dairy councils and industries
That's
that
right.
are driving their decisions to support livestock, emphasize the importance of CO2 and downplaying the emphasis of methane. So
Right.
I know you didn't get into that, but I think that's worthy of a discussion to realize that it's not just the cultural dictates, but there are seeds of greed that are behind some of these choices that we somehow have to look at and be aware of.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And there's greed behind the IPCC and some of the government. But I mean, look at the way our Surgeon General and our CDC reacted to COVID, right? They did everything they could to cooperate with the drug companies, and they didn't once tell people to eat a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. Now, there was a study in BMJ that showed 72% less severe COVID on a whole food, plant-based diet. If 1 million Americans died of COVID, presumably that advice, if taken, could have saved about 750,000 lives. And why don't they say it? Do they not know it? I have to think it's more to do with greed in working with these drug companies. However, the cultural side of things is what I believe is what's most behind why people at the grassroots eat the way they do. I don't think, for the most part, that they're reading the IPCC reports and saying, oh, the IPCC says the problem is the burning of fossil fuels, so I'll keep eating meat. I just think people eat what they eat because of their culture.
Oh, I don't disagree with that. I think the point I'm trying to make is that if you look at medical practice, no one's going to deny the altruism of many of the individual doctors, regardless of how they practice.
Mm-hmm.
But there is that pharma complex that's behind that is vested in the idea that they need to be disease managers rather than true healthcare providers. That's what I meant.
Yes,
So the general person doesn't, they go to their doc, and the doc's like said, do this. And they're kind of like, I like my doc, and I grew up knowing that doctors know everything, and that's what I trust. So I get all of that, but somehow you got to at some point, you've got to pull the veil away and make people realize that, you know what, there's vested interest here all the time. And you need to be aware of the fact that, as altruistic or as lovely as some of these people may be, they're fostering ways of doing things that are not in your best interest, because there's really greedy forces that are trying to promote that continues. That's all I was saying.
Yeah, well, we're in agreement.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a process that we all, especially all the doctors that do counseling work, deal with on a moment-to-moment basis. Because, like you say, the same way you presented the 70 years of incredible science that shows that there's no evidence that suggests meat's going to reverse pathology. The only thing it just reinforces devastating disease. But it's the same issue that the regular person tends not to read those scientific papers either, just the same way they don't read the IPCC. So they're trusting these voices of authority, and that can be very problematic, because it in my observation, in my experience, it disengages people from the power and autonomy that they have to heal, the same way the earth does, the same way the human body does. And we've been kind of brought up to fear our own vitality, this idea that symptoms, and the NHA is very much about this, where they look at symptoms as one of the ways the body manifests healing. If you have a headache or a discharge or
Right.
whatever. And so we're brought up to think when that happens, you've got to medicate that out of existence. And so that starts to set a tone where you're kind of subservient to the dominion of these voices of authority that certainly would not lead you astray. And
Right.
I think that's part of that cultural bias that you're talking about. And
Right.
it's a real hurdle that has to be transcended if you're going to get to the other side.
Right. Our culture teaches us how to eat so that we become overweight and sick, and then how to trust doctors to take care of us with
Right.
medications. And that's not a good model for health.
Now, and you made the point the doctors have the same diseases and the same rate of disease as the people they're treating, which is
Pretty
even
much.
worse.
Yeah.
Which, good luck.
Pretty much.
Good luck in that counseling. It's like the
Yeah.
guy you come out, you go to you have a heart problem, you go to the cardiologist, he's got a belly out here, he's got a
Yeah.
cigar in his hand telling you how to live.
Yeah.
It's not, who do you pay attention to? So the point of that is that, yeah, I mean, all of that grassroots. Let's talk about that grassroots approach, because I know when you look at someone like Dr. Rao and other people, they talk about that shift into a global plant economy, basically. And that's what we know. We have to go there. We know that we don't have a lot of time if we don't stop futzing around. And that idea of the shy vegan, I love talking with Milton Mills. He says we're at a point where vegans need to be shouting from the rooftops and screaming from every street and alleyway about veganism, not hiding out and almost apologizing. There's still a lot of people
Right.
that apologize for that lifestyle. And
Yeah.
like you said, you made that evolution from shy to expansive. But in a way, the time is now to kind of speak it out loud. And so how do you see that in your vision? Because I know you've done a lot of research. How do we shift that grazing land into land that we can get back into wilding, so that now we can grow food with cropland and use all that land to plant trees and sequester carbon? What's the process of that in the
Um,
economic scene, where people are always concerned that they're going to lose money if they shift their professions away from one kind of farming to, even animal abuse, to another kind of farming?
the fate of the earth rests on the answer to that question. And, it's all over the world. It's not just in the United States, although the United States is a pretty bad example of it, because about 50% of our land is given over to the cows. So how do we change the economic incentives so that the people in animal agriculture get out of it? And how do we change our understanding of diet so that the grassroots will follow the path of eating human food the way you and I do, and stop poisoning themselves? I tend to put my emphasis on the grassroots. The model I always think of is gay marriage, because even if you remember, as recently as when President Obama was first elected in 2008, he didn't support gay marriage. He didn't talk about it. And by the end of his presidency, it was the law of the land. And the reason that happened was because people watched television shows with gay characters. And in people's own lives, gay individuals, friends, relatives came out, and people just accepted that love is love, and there's no reason why gay individuals shouldn't be allowed to get married. And that's what we have to do. We have to have that grassroots revolution where so many people realize, oh, the reason I'm getting fat and sick is this food I've been eating with animals. And I need to eat plant food, whole plant food. And if enough people will realize that, what seems to me obvious truth, then the culture will change. The animal agriculture won't be able to continue if there's, let's say, a 40% drop in demand for their products. I would love it too if we would stop the federal subsidies to animal agriculture, but that's a hard lift because it's apparently the one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree upon is that we should give our tax dollars to the animal agriculture industry. That's the one thing that unites Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders. They all vote for funds for animal agriculture. So I really think we have to count on the people to change their diet. And then it's still, as you know, daunting. It's hard to get millions of Americans and billions of people around the world to see what seems to you and me and a lot of other people the obvious truth. There are no studies that broccoli is bad for you. There's no studies that cauliflower is bad for you. But there's an unlimited number of studies that milk and dairy and flesh foods are bad for you. And then there's just an analysis. You look at the macronutrients. Yeah, obviously the fat in flesh foods has been associated with heart disease for 70 years. There's no carbohydrate in flesh foods. There's no fiber. The water, there's a little bit of water, and you know what some of that water is? It's what they call retained water, which is a very nice phrase. Retained water means it's retained from when they spray the carcasses in the slaughterhouse. Mm-hmm. It's slaughterhouse water. Would anybody bottle and market slaughterhouse water you have with a twist of lime? Who wants to drink slaughterhouse water? Mm-hmm. And then you got the protein, and that's been there. The one thing the meat industry hung on to and promoted, get your animal protein. Well, first of all, you don't need it. You and I are fine without the animal protein. But second of all, Dr. T. Colin Campbell proved that it's carcinogenic. So it's unhealthy protein. So it's got nothing. How anyone can make a case for it is beyond me. It's got nothing but harm. So,
yeah. And in those early studies, by the way, as you know, Colin's protein was casein, which is the major milk protein. So that's the one that he revealed to be the most devastating in those early studies.
Absolutely.
Well, Glenn, before we go on, because I want to go on, let people know where they can find you. How can they follow you? How can they find your books, your information? What's a URL or a location for you?
I have a website, glenmerzer.com. That's Merzer with a Z. And I have started a YouTube channel. So they could Google the Glen Merzer Show and find it there. And, I've always admired what Chef AJ did with her YouTube channel. And I always wanted to see if I could.
She's amazing. It's amazing. But she really works it, though. I mean, she does it daily. I mean, it's a full-time job for her. So
yeah.
She really works. Do you think that the primary avenue is the selfishness of personal health, or do we need to really get them into understanding kind of what I'll call the personhood of animals in addition to the environmental consequences? What do you feel about that?
Well, there are three paths usually that people take to a healthy whole food vegan diet. One is a concern about health. One is a concern about the animals, and one is a concern about the environment and the climate. And I've had discussions with friends about which path tends to lead to a more, sustained change. The problem with those who become vegans just out of their love and concern for animals is they often eat vegan donuts. Right. They become junk food vegans. They're not concerned with their own health. And my case to them is, if you care so much about the animals, and you want to fight for the animals, be healthy, live to 100 or longer, be a good role model for other people. Because if you're going to be an obese vegan, you're not going to change too many minds, and you're unlikely to live as long to fight for the animals. So everybody who goes vegan ought to do so with some concern for health. If your concern is merely your own health, as mine was for the first, 5 years or so that I was a vegan before I met Howard Lyman, then you might be a shy vegan and you might not help promote this cause. And it is a cause because we have to save the planet. So I would love to see more people understand that this is what they must do for the planet.
Right.
You know, when you think of how many ills are caused by animal agriculture, first, it makes people fat and sick. Second, it costs us food. We have less food. You know, they call these people who raise animals farmers. It's the point I make in my new book, America Goes Vegan. They're anti-farmers. Farmers grow food. We have less food because of animal agriculture. We're feeding crops to animals. We're feeding grains to animals. And we get less food out of it. So we have less food because of animal agriculture. We have far, far more pollution. We have these lagoons of manure because really they are in the manure business. They're just producing tons and tons of manure, which fouls the land and destroys property values, and it becomes, you know, a threat to people's health who live near these operations. They are employing in the animal agriculture industry today, you might have thought child labor was done with in America, but they are employing 13-year-olds from Honduras in their slaughterhouses to do the dirty work of cleaning the machinery in the slaughterhouses. Dirty and dangerous work, spraying this machinery with harsh chemicals. And so who do they use? They use a population that can't defend itself. 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds who are undocumented from Honduras. That's who they're employing in these slaughterhouses. This is an evil industry.
Well, it's another example of a certain kind of evil human trafficking. Let's be realistic. You know,
Yeah.
we always think about that only in the form of like sexual abuse, but this is a different kind of
Yeah.
unreal abuse. I mean, it's horrible. It's a
Yeah.
horrible thing.
This is a despicable industry. And then then on top of that, it creates pandemics. We don't, when, do you remember learning about a zucchini pandemic? I don't think so. You know, there are no pandemics caused by zucchini or cauliflower, but when you house animals together on top of each other in a way that is unnatural, you get pandemics. So did we enjoy COVID? Do we want the bird flu next, the pig flu? What are we aiming for next? So you get obesity, heart disease, diabetes, inflammatory conditions, all kinds of health conditions caused by the foolishness of eating animals. You get pandemics, you foul the waterways, you pollute the air, and there's so much methane emitted that it's a great cause of climate change just by the direct emissions. But then, as Dr. Silas Rao points out, you don't just count the direct emissions, you have to do a fair accounting. And the fair accounting would be, well, what if you didn't have animal agriculture and all that land had forest and vegetation? Then how much carbon dioxide would you sequester? Answer, enough to end the climate emergency. And when we see the temperatures in Phoenix, what was it, something like 115 degrees or over for 40 days in a row? How much closer do we get to an immense tragedy? If it gets to 120 degrees, what if the power goes out? How much hotter do we saw the fire in Maui that was such a tragedy that killed so many people. The fires in Greece, you know, how much worse do we want this to get before we realize that we can't devote 40% of the earth to giving ourselves heart attacks? That's just remarkably foolish. So, you know, we have to rewild that land and eat human food. And it isn't hard and it's delicious. It's just amazing to me that people don't get it.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And, you know, it's on a simple level, it's, you know, when you look at laws of thermodynamics, for example, the concept is that energy can't be destroyed. It can only be changed from available to unavailable sources. So there's a stable quantity. So when you look at the production of food and you look at the primary source of energy in the sun, this was ecology 101. Plants are capturing that sun to produce food. As you go up the food chain, not only are you making energy less and less and less available, you're creating more and more entropy and disorder, because that's what balances it out. And that disorder is death and destruction.
Yeah.
So on a simple physical plane, the idea of moving away from plant foods moves us away from available energy, as you talked about, food sources, land resources, into absolute unavailable death and destruction, entropy, disorder.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is, if we don't address that, as you point out, it's huge. But when I talked about animals before, the thing that came up for me, though, is it's interesting. There's a long history of looking at animals as things. So we have this remarkable dichotomy that, our house pet has a name and he's part of the family, but
Right.
that kind of black box animal that's being slaughtered in the Netherlands, in the nether sphere, of course, has no name and becomes kind of separate from us. It's interesting. I recently found out about a group of attorneys that have spent about 30 years trying to surrogately protect the habeas corpus rights of animals in captivity, which is kind of intriguing. The idea that they can fight for the unlawful incarceration of animals, so that we start to see that compassion, that really what this lifestyle is really all about,
Right.
under really reinforcing the connectedness of this. And no creature, us, them, no one can be really looked at as a thing. These animals have agency, they have sentience, they have all of those things that we try to believe are only unique to us. And yet we need to really embrace that in this ahimsa, compassionate direction that this whole lifestyle takes us. And I think all of those pieces will dovetail into realizing that, yeah, these things are not to be eaten, while we maintain some dominion. With great power comes great responsibility. And that
Right.
responsibility is to emphasize ourselves as really benevolent caregivers, supporting that interconnectedness of all creation, which will, of course, go directly into the abuses of the climate itself that have been, the
Right.
loss of species. When I learned that from 1970 to 2014, more than 60% of all, wild animals on the planet are gone.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's an unconscionable thing to even think about when you think about that in that short period of time.
We're going from a universe of beautiful wild animals to just cows.
Right.
It's the cows have a very, very high, I forget the statistic, but a very, very high percentage of the biomass of animals on the planet now. There's something like 1.5 billion cows. It's not even a natural species. The original species was oxen. And I guess we kind of bred them into being these fatty things that we eat. They are apparently the biggest fish predators on Earth. You wouldn't have thought that cows were fish predators, but we rape the oceans, we get the fish, we feed it to cows. It's mass insanity.
And your point of raping the ocean, which is about 70% of planet Earth, to only avail ourselves of a couple of percentage points of food, which is absurd, while we destroy everything in that ocean with trawling and phytoplankton beds and all of the things that sequester carbon, produce oxygen, all of these incredible things that ocean provides, how we so mindlessly just feel compelled to just rape through these incredible, beautiful, majestic things on the planet. What did you hope to really, what was your goal, your vision for the book, your most recent book? What was your purpose in doing that book, in your mind, in your mindset?
Well, my most recent book is America Goes Vegan,
Right,
with recipes by Tracy Childs. And the idea of this book was to make some points that admittedly I've made before, that on the health front and on the environmental front, of worded in a different way and with a new angle, but the case for a whole food, low-fat, plant-based diet. But in addition, I wanted to make the case that I haven't heard made before, that it is the patriotic thing to do. I mean, do we want to have this beautiful land of the United States ruined by manure, by lagoons of manure? Do we want to turn it into desert? Because let me show you a picture from the front cover of my book, Food is Climate. This is the red areas that you see here are the pasture maintenance fires that are set annually on grazing land. And the brown area you see here is desert. It's not a very surprising look because we know where the deserts are. They're at the top of Africa, Sahara Desert, across to India, across to the Gobi Desert in China. But look how they're almost all connected there. It's a 6,000-mile stretch of nearly continuous desert. How did that happen? Was the earth just created wrong and a lot of desert was just created there? No, that's where civilization began. Humans did that. It used to be what could have been called the Sahara Forest.
Right.
And human beings started grazing goats and sheep and oxen and cows. And we created 6,000 miles of desert. Well, we're going to do that to the United States if we keep doing this. We're going to have deserts spreading throughout the United States. And so do we want to have soldiers with atherosclerosis? Do we want to have lagoons of manure? Do we want to destroy this land with deserts? Do we want to foul our waterways? You know, eating hamburgers is very unpatriotic. So I wanted to make the case that if you love your country, it's yet another reason to go vegan. You know, protect this beautiful land and help restore it.
Yeah, that balance is so important. And that compassion, I mean, that whole idea of this compassionate approach is something we can never really forget, because that element of us understanding, and again, I say this in a more quasi-spiritual way, because when we talk about spirituality, to me, it's not about religion. It's about the idea that we have some sense of our connection, of our choices, and how they affect things outside of us. So to me, there's nothing like this vegan approach, this plant-focused, plant-exclusive approach, for taking us into that realm of seeing those connections, of understanding the power that our choices have to either make this go one way or make it go another that can be quite devastating. And I think the human conceit is that, like other species that never were able to adapt, that no longer exist, I think somewhere we have this sense that it doesn't matter what we do, we'll always survive. And that's not really the case. The earth, I believe, will renew itself. Whether it renews itself with us or not, I think has a lot to do with what we decide to do with the food that we're eating, especially plant-exclusive food. So Glenn, as we wrap this up, so to speak, what's some final words you'd like to really share, some final thoughts you'd like to really share with the audience out here?
Well, I want to thank you and the National Health Association, which is a wonderful organization that everyone should join. It's been promoting healthy ways of eating for decades. And I want to just emphasize that there's nothing difficult about eating human food. You know, one thing that I have very mixed feelings about is the idea of meatless Mondays. You know, there are good people and good organizations that promote Meatless Monday, and their heart is in the right place. And, you know, and maybe sometimes it works. Maybe sometimes people start with Meatless Monday, and pretty soon it's Meatless Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and then they become vegan. So I'm not knocking anybody. I'm not attacking anyone for promoting Meatless Monday. But I just want to make the case that it isn't that hard. You know, you don't really have to start off with just Monday. If you're on the standard American diet, you could switch overnight. There's nothing so hard about cooking rice. There's nothing so hard about boiling water and making pasta, making oatmeal. There's nothing so hard, you know, even if you start with a can of beans rather than making the beans from dry beans. It's nothing so hard about opening a can of beans. It's nothing so hard about learning to put tempeh in the toaster oven. There's nothing so hard about steaming vegetables or water frying them. You know, it's not hard to do. And your health gets better. You know, I think in my life, everyone I have known who has made the transition has been happy with it and has gotten healthier and lost weight if they needed to lose weight. It always works. Whenever I meet someone with high cholesterol and I get them onto the diet, their cholesterol goes down. People get off their diabetes medication if it's type 2 diabetes. It always works. I am at the same weight I was in high school. There's really no reason why when you get older you have to put on 40 pounds. And so I just want to make the case there's nothing hard about this. You really don't have to start with Meatless Monday. You can do it overnight. And there's so many resources out there, so many cookbooks, so many health books, so many ways to get support. Become an NHA member, follow Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, listen to AJ's videos, Chef AJ Live, go to my YouTube channel. There's so many out there. It isn't hard. So that's the case I want to make. There's nothing difficult about this, and it's so obvious that we must do it. There is no legitimate scientific case for eating flesh foods. There simply is none. There are some, hacks out there who make arguments, but they have no case.
I want to really thank my special guest, Glen Merzer, today for being with us, sharing his insight, his heart, his vision, and I urge you to follow him. His location will be in our show notes. I urge you to read the books that he's been connected to, watch his show. His work is actually really transformative. It will really help you clearly see the path that is necessary for us to really improve personal health and the health of this planet. And I want to really thank the people that have joined us today. Without you, we couldn't do what we do. I want to thank you for being part of this really active, healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Thank you so much. You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.